Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are here to talk about the Balance of State Continuum of Care HUD published NOFO. Thank you all for taking time to join us today. If you could, please introduce yourself in the chat. That will help us understand who is in the room. So please put your name, what organization or community you represent, and what Balance of State region you are in. Again, this webinar is being recorded currently and will be posted along with the slides to our Division of Housing webpage that will have all of our NOFO competition materials on it. We have a lot of content to get through today, so please post any questions that you have as they come up into the chat. We're going to be monitoring that, writing down all of the questions. At the end, we will go through whatever questions we are able to. But we're also going to be putting together a FAQ document that will be on our webpage for any questions that we're not able to answer or any that are just frequently asked. So please be sure to share your questions as we go. So I want to start quickly by doing some introductions to the Division of Housing team. My name is Jerry Erickson. I am the Balance of State Continuum of Care Director and oversee all things Balance of State COC at the Division of Housing. So all things lead agency. So our collaborative applicant side, which is the side of the house that is leading this NOFO competition, and then our homeless management information team as well. I do want to note that we are distinct from Division of Housing applicant, and I know there are some applicants in the room. So Division of Housing also runs some direct services and programs from the COC, but we operate as a different team. I also want to take a sec to have Natalie introduce herself.
Thanks, Jerry. Hi, y'all. Good morning. My name is Natalie Kinniger. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Balance of State Continuum of Care team lead. So I am on the collaborative applicant side, helping to lead that team. Thanks, y'all.
Today we are here to talk about the fiscal year 2025 COC funding competition. The name can be a little bit confusing because it is the end of 2025 and it'll be due in 2026. But this is for the federal fiscal year 2025 COC program, the NOFO that was just published earlier this month. We are going to do a high-level overview of that NOFO publication, talk about what we know, talk about some changes that are coming this year, and then also talk about our process more broadly. And again, we'll have time for questions and comments at the end. I do want to take a second to kind of contextualize this for anybody who is new. And if you are familiar with the NOFO and have been through the process before, just please bear with us as we do some level setting for those who are newer to this process or less familiar. Today, we are only going to be doing, like I said, a high-level overview of the published NOFO, and would recommend, if you are newer to this process, to review the recording from last year's webinar. We did do a bit of a deeper dive of like the program conceptually and kind of how it all works. So recommend that you review that. We will send that out in our follow-up email. Again, this is intended to be, this webinar is for anybody who is interested in COC funding, who currently has COC funding, or would like to pursue COC funding, or just generally curious about how NOFO funding works. We will have a follow-up webinar for those organizations who ultimately end up pursuing funding. So that will be, we'll talk more about that later today, but this is high level, and then that follow-up will be more in-depth about how to actually apply for the funds, specifically within the Balance of State COC. And you'll get invited to that webinar once you submit a letter of intent, which we'll talk about that process here in a little bit. So again, intended audience for this webinar right now, organizations and entities who are interested in applying for HUD COC funding or want to learn more about it. And this program is focused on providing direct housing services and homeless response system improvements within the Balance of State Continuum of Care. We are only able to put forth applications for the Balance of State or programs that operate within our geographic area, which Natalie just put in the chat. We are a 54 county region, pretty much everything except for the Front Range. So if you're in Denver Metro or operating programs in Denver Metro, El Paso County or Larimer or Weld, then those are different COCs, have different processes that are responding to this NOFO application. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is, again, for HUD. Housing and Urban Development has posted this NOFO competition. The application itself can be found on grants.gov. So you'll need to have a grants.gov account to be able to access the application materials. And then the actual application itself will be in eSnaps, which again, we'll talk about in a minute. So I want to talk again broadly about what the COC or Continuum of Care or NOFO is. This is a program competition that occurs annually. HUD requires continuums of care to register. HUD then reviews existing grant information, then release the NOFO, which announces how the competition process is going to happen. So that's where we are in the process. There are two distinct sides of the COC NOFO process, one of which is the consolidated application. That is looking at us as a balance of state COC holistically. It is a demonstration of how we operate as a COC. So Division of Housing team will be leading that application process and will be informed by many of our partners. And there'll be more information coming about that. And then there's also project applications. Project applications are for to apply for projects that provide housing services to people experiencing homelessness in our geographic area. These project applications go through the COC, so they are submitted to the COC. Division of Housing is the lead agency for the COC, and then we submit them alongside the consolidated application. I do want to clarify that ultimately, once HUD makes funding decisions and makes awards, the contracts are going to be directly between HUD and those program applicants. So while the COC is a part of the application process, we are not a part of the contracting process, and that will happen between the entity that applies and HUD directly. I also want to note that the project applications are always in eSnaps, and those they're not available in eSnaps yet. So we do not have access to the full program application or the consolidated application yet. We are hoping that they will be published soon. When we were on a webinar with HUD last Friday, they said in coming weeks. So we're hopeful that this week or next, they will be in eSnaps. If you are not yet registered in eSnaps, recommend that you get signed up as soon as possible. There are various HUD resources that will guide you through how to create an account and how to access applications, but that will be necessary in order to apply for COC funding. So be sure that you and your organization have registered for eSnaps and are able to access that so that when the applications do become available, you can quickly get in and receive the program application information. We will also send out kind of the sign up guide in the registration instructions that Natalie explained in the chat in our follow-up email as well. Okay. So funding overview for this year. So this year's NOFO is due January 14th, 2026. May seem far away, but it's actually quite close because we are required to receive the project applications 30 days before that. They're going to be due from you all to us as the COC by the end of the day on December 14th. So we only have a handful of weeks between now and then. So we are in a bit of a truncated timeline this year. Do you want to note there's $3.9 billion available for this COC funding opportunity, of which about $4 million is designated for us as the balance of state continuum of care. This is an increase in prior years, and that has been a part of their communications. This does come with some major changes to the programs, program types allowable and scoring, which we're going to dig into a little bit, but just want to note that. Do you want to highlight some of the major changes? And I will also caveat, if you are interested in applying for COC NOFO funding, please do read the full publication of the NOFO. It's quite a lengthy document. We are not able to review every single thing that is a part of it today, but it is important that you understand everything that is being asked of you during the application process and what HUD is going to be asking of you during the contracting process and when you're actually executing these programs. So please be sure to read that. Some of the highlights, though, or big changes from last year are on this slide. So first I want to talk about is the changes to Tier 1 and Tier 2 funding. So, Tier 1 and Tier 2 is something that has been a part of the COC program for a long time, and is based off of our annual renewal demand, which is a budget number, that about $4 million that we have for the balance of state, that comprises of all of our renewal applications. Typically, there is an increase for cost of services, cost of housing, so that tends to go up year after year. And the annual renewal demand is the maximum amount of money that our COC can apply for. At this point, with this NOFO, Tier 1 is now capped at 30% of our annual renewal demand. Historically, that has been 90%. So it's a pretty significant decrease in Tier 1. Why that is important is because Tier 1 is essentially what we think of as like non-competitive funding. So Tier 1, we expect HUD will fund without any major concerns there. Tier 2, which historically has been 10% and is now 70%, are dependent on our COC overall score, so that consolidated application I was talking about earlier. And projects are going to be competing with other projects nationally. So this is a pretty big shift in how HUD is going to be scoring applications and ultimately making funding awards. Ultimately, like what this means for us is that the majority of our funding is now competitive nationally, when historically the majority of our funding has just been competitive within our own COC. And we locally have been able to make decisions about what projects we want to prioritize. So this is a significant change and a difficult change for our continuum of care. Another difficult change for our COC as well as COCs nationally is permanent housing is now limited to 30% of our annual renewal demand. Permanent housing in COC world and in HUD's eyes for this program includes our permanent supportive housing projects, our rapid rehousing projects, and any joint transitional housing rapid rehousing projects. So as a continuum of care, we are only able to submit for about $1.2 million in permanent housing funding. Currently, we are funded at over $3 million in permanent housing. So we are going to need to make some difficult decisions, and only the highest ranking permanent housing projects will be able to be put forward for funding, because if we put forward any requests for funding in addition to that 30%, they will be rejected and they will not be funded. So we're going to need to work with projects to reallocate any permanent housing that is in excess of that 30%. This is all quite technical, and again, if you are new to the HUD process, may be difficult to wrap your head around. So really the important thing to know at this point is that our COC, most of our projects are going to be competing nationally for funding instead of competing locally, and we have limits on how much permanent housing we can put forth in this application. We're going to go a little bit more in depth of what that means for us as a COC a little bit later, but kind of wanted to highlight some of the larger changes that we are seeing to the COC project this year. A couple important things just to note is that everything except for our continuum of care planning grant is competitive and must be ranked in Tier 1 or Tier 2. And this includes our Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, or YHDP. Prior to the publication of the NOFO, HUD had been in a practice of allowing COCs to submit renewal applications for YHDP non-competitively. And this year they are required to be a part of the COC's rating and ranking process. So this is something we were not expecting as a COC, and will ultimately impact the ratings that we submit. Kind of similarly, our special NOFO, any projects that were awarded under the special NOFO that expire in calendar year 2026 are eligible to apply for renewal. We were unsure if those projects were going to be eligible for renewal ever. They were initially billed as one-time funding, so those projects are able to submit for renewal this year. And then the eligible project types under this notice of funding opportunity are transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, homeless management information system, and then supportive services only. Supportive services only can be a coordinated entry project, street outreach project, or a regular SSO. We're going to go more in depth about these projects in just a little bit, but want to note that because of the limits on permanent housing, it's unlikely that we'll be accepting any new projects for rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing because most of our funding, renewal funding, is already within those categories. And then also just want to note too that the HMIS funding is for the designated entity, the lead agency, which at this point is the Division of Housing. So most of our new applications this year will be either transitional housing or one of the supportive services only project types. Again, we're going to go more in depth about the actual application process at our webinar next week. I want to talk a little bit about the HUD homelessness policy priorities for this year. It is important that you read the full description within the NOFO. It's on page 12 and 13 of the published NOFO. Again, that can be accessed on grants.gov and are really meant to provide context for applications to better understand how the programs are intended to operate, the merit criteria of our COC, and will ultimately impact funding awards. So some of those priorities are ending the crisis of homelessness. There is definitely an increased prioritization of treatment and recovery services, advancement of public safety that includes partnerships with law enforcement and first responders, promotion of self-sufficiency with a particular emphasis on employment, improving outcomes, and minimizing trauma to folks who are experiencing homelessness. Okay, so for our COC specifically, every COC nationally receives this annual renewal demand, again, based off of renewals, as well as some other elements we're going to talk about. So we, as the COC, the maximum amount of funding that we can put forth as a part of this notice of funding opportunity is $4,083,405. Our Tier 1 funding is capped at $1,225,022. And I think I misspoke a little bit earlier. Last year, it was a little bit over $2 million, so a reduction there because of that 90% down to 30%. And then Tier 2 funding will be inclusive of all of our other new projects, including COC bonus, domestic violence bonus funding, and our COC planning funding. The DV bonus is something that HUD does periodically and is specifically for folks who are serving people who are experiencing domestic violence. Domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, who are also experiencing homelessness. There are very specific definitions of how HUD looks at people who are experiencing homelessness and the DV bonus, people who are served by the DV bonus funds as well. So if you're interested in those, please make sure to review the NOFO thoroughly for what that entails specifically under the HUD definitions and this NOFO in particular. Excuse me. Again, this is our annual renewal demand is higher than last year and quite a bit higher than last year. And partially that is because it includes YHDP, which was not a part of our last year's ARD, as well as the SNOFO. And then, like I talked about earlier, the typical increased cost of housing and services lead to that annual renewal amount. Okay. I am going to pass it to Natalie, but are there any questions so far? I know that we've gone through a lot of content pretty quickly. Okay.
Okay, great. And again, if you do have any questions while I'm talking through these next couple of slides, please put them in the chat. If we have time, we'll lift them up here, but if not, we'll make sure they get answered. But I am now going to go over our timeline. So I'm going to review key dates and important considerations for project applications, as well as our COC application. So November 14th, 2025, HUD released the FY 2025 Notice of Funding Opportunity for the COC. November 28th, which is this Friday, the letter of intent or LOI is due for all renewal and new applicants. This is non-binding, meaning if you submit an LOI and then decide not to submit an application, totally fine, but it is required for any organization that plans on applying. As you're going to see over these next few slides, we have a pretty condensed timeline. And so this is really giving us as much time as possible to plan for the amount of applications that we are going to have. So if you are considering submitting an application, that LOI is due by this Friday, end of day. December 3rd is that second webinar that we will be hosting from 12 to 1. This is for all folks who submit that LOI and are prospective applicants. On December 14th, 2025 by 11:59 Mountain Time, so by end of day, that is the deadline for program applications, both new and renewal. And again, HUD has not posted the program applications yet. So that is not available yet. That's not something you're able to see, unfortunately. But this deadline is based on HUD requirements. So HUD requires program applications to be due no later than 30 days prior to the federal submission date, which you're going to see in the next slide is on January 14th. So that December 14th deadline is a hard deadline that comes kind of directly from HUD. Okay. December 19th, 2025, all applicants will be notified of their ranking. So after applicants submit their ranking on December 14th, we have our rating and ranking committee, which is a required part of the NOFO process, and they review all applicants with our scoring tools, which will be shared publicly. Excuse me. And then those scores and rankings will be shared with applicants by end of day, December 19th, which is a Friday. Appeals to that ranking will be due by 3 p.m. Monday. So, excuse me, y'all. That is a very quick turnaround. And again, you're going to see, you see on the slide there, part of that is because of HUD required deadlines and then also the holidays. So want to make you all aware, very much so ahead of time of that deadline. You will receive your rankings if you apply by end of day on the 19th. If you plan to appeal, and the process for how to do that will also be shared on the 19th. The process for how to do that appeal will be due by 3 p.m. December 22nd. That is because our governing board is going to be voting to approve the final application rankings on December 23rd, 2025, again, to avoid that Christmas holiday a bit. And then applicants will be notified of their finalized ranking on December 29th. So HUD requires that all applicants be notified of their finalized ranking at least 14 days before that final deadline. So that final deadline is January 14th, 2026, 6 p.m. Mountain Time, and 14 days prior to that is the required deadline for notifying all applicants. Okay.
Can we go back to slide, Natalie? There was a question about who's responsible for some of these steps. So I do want to clarify a little bit. When we're talking about applicants or prospective applicants, we are talking about the entity that is going to be applying for program funds and then administering or sub-awarding out those funds. If you are a current grantee and you're applying for renewals, you're either a direct grantee from HUD, so you have a contract with HUD, or you're a subrecipient. There's a lot of subrecipients in our COC. So if you are have COC funds for your organization, but you do not have that contract directly with HUD, you maybe have it with the Division of Housing or Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, then the actual applicant, DOH or CCH in these examples, would be the ones who are submitting that letter of intent in those program applications and will be coordinating with you as a subgrantee. We do only need one letter of intent for each program. So if you're an applicant that is either currently has multiple programs or intending to apply for different multiple program types, you'll need to submit multiple LOIs. And then generally after that, it's up to you as an organization about kind of who's doing what in terms of the application. Within eSNAPS, there is like a primary contact page. So that is the person that we as the COC will be coordinating with. So put whoever makes sense for your organization to receive the rankings and the appeal process. Like that's who we're going to be communicating with if we need anything else for the program application. Does that answer your question? Great. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions on the timeline before we move on? Okay. Am I understanding that if we apply for Yes. So those are, if you are applying for 2 projects, you will submit 2 letters of intent. Because there's a project description in that Google form, it is fairly quick. Hopefully, it's pretty much just a summary of what you'll be applying for, but every individual project needs a letter of intent, Carlton. And I think Jerry mentioned this, but I know this was a question we got last year. So just to reiterate, if you are a subrecipient, the recipient will submit the LOI. So many of you on the call are subrecipients of Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. Last year, they submitted all of the LOIs for all of their projects that they then grant out to some of you all on this call.
And the purpose of that LOI is really to help us plan as a COC with our rating and ranking committee of how we are going to process all of those applications. And again, it's non-binding. So if you're interested, please submit one. If you ultimately end up not submitting an application, that is totally fine.
Cool. Okay. Jumping into our next section, which is eligibility threshold, merit review, risk review. We're going to go into detail on what each of these means, but these are essentially all of the considerations that HUD uses to make funding decisions. Okay. Project eligibility threshold. So at the project level, eligibility threshold criteria has always been a requirement to receive funding. Projects have to meet certain eligibility requirements in order to be reviewed and rated and ranked. And there has always been a pass-fail assessment to determine if a project is meeting that minimum criteria. So that pass-fail standard has always been a part of this and looks at things to ensure the project applicants are eligible, have the capacity for the project, agree to be an HMIS, and are essentially doing all the things that they are required to do and that they agree to do them if they are funded. In 2025, there are some major changes that are listed here on the slide to project eligibility thresholds. So individual projects are going to have to certify that they will not engage in racial preferences or other forms of illegal discrimination, and will not operate drug injection sites or safe consumption sites, knowingly distribute drug paraphernalia, permit the use or distribution of illicit drugs, or conduct any of these activities under the pretext of harm reduction. So these are pulled directly from the NOFO, and this is new language in 2025. Okay, so specifically for renewal projects now, there has always been a standard review to assess that they are meeting those minimum requirements, like I just mentioned, and then also that they are meeting performance standards. Excuse me. So this is also a pass-fail standard, and this is essentially looking to ensure that the project is a quality project and that they are meeting minimum eligibility, capacity, and those performance standards. And again, pass-fail standard every year. There is some new language in 2025 added to this quality threshold criteria. So HUD states that they reserve the right to reduce or reject a project application for the following new reasons. Evidence that the project has previously or currently conducts activities to subsidize or facilitate racial preferences or other forms of illegal discrimination, or conducts activities that rely on or otherwise use a definition of sex other than binary in humans. And then that same harm reduction language as the previous slide. So similar to the eligibility threshold, but a little bit more detailed here, that HUD reserves the right to reduce or reject a project application for these reasons. Okay, so new project quality threshold criteria. So again, if you pass that eligibility threshold as a new project, HUD will then review the project against quality criteria. There is different criteria for each program type this year. To be awarded, new projects must receive a minimum score, which I'm going to go over in a minute. However, the NOFO states that if you are awarded, the project will be expected to meet all criteria. So if you are going to apply for a new project, it is really important to review the entire new project quality criteria, because if you are funded, you are going to be expected to meet all of them, not just a minimum of 7 of 10 or whatever is required. If funded, you will be required to meet all of them. And again, there is different criteria for different new project types. So I am going to run through the key criteria for each project type. So either the key changes or the highlights here. But again, if you're going to apply for new funding, read through the full criteria. And a few through lines that I wanted to call out because they align with that policy priorities. There we go. I combined priorities and criteria there. That Jerry mentioned earlier. And again, just to reiterate, 70% of our funding is now competitive nationally. So that means we are being scored against all COCs across the country, all individual projects. So these criteria and priorities are really important when deciding if folks are going to get funded or not. So a few through lines, though, again, that they call out multiple times: public-private partnerships, engaging with law enforcement, requiring service participation, and self-sufficiency. Those are a lot of the through lines, but again, I'm going to go through these individual projects fairly quickly now. Excuse me. So transitional housing, there you must get a minimum score of 7 out of 10. Supportive services will be required for participation. Projects will have to provide 40 hours of customized services for participants. There are a few exceptions to that. And then again, those public-private partnerships are an important piece here as well. Just quickly, those exceptions, because I know that's a common question, are those who are older than 63. There's a prorated amount of 40 hours for those who work, and then those who have physical disabilities. For supportive services only, SSO standalone, there's a minimum of 4 out of 5 points that have to be scored in order to be considered. And the key criteria here is, again, public-private sources, providing services necessary to exit homelessness and increase self-sufficiency, and specifically those who do not traditionally engage in services. SSO street outreach. So in addition to those standalone SSO criteria, you must also have experience providing outreach services and demonstrate a history of partnering with first responders and law enforcement, and will not interfere with the enforcement of public camping and drug use laws. And then SSO coordinated entry. This is actually pretty standard compared to previous years, but must be available and reachable in all geographic areas, and a strategy and have a strategy for reaching those with the highest needs, and then have a standardized assessment to ensure participants are getting directed to the services that they need. Okay, permanent housing projects, Jerry mentioned this earlier. There is technically an opportunity for new permanent housing, but they will have to fit in to that 30% threshold cap for permanent housing, which means it is very, very, very unlikely that we will receive any new permanent housing funding because of that. But just to cover it, the permanent supportive housing criteria is a minimum of 4 out of 6. Again, public-private partnerships, required participation, and then designed to serve elderly individuals or people with a physical disability or developmental disability, which is typical for permanent supportive housing. But a key difference here compared to previous years is that substance abuse, mental health, and behavioral health disabilities are not included here in permanent housing criteria. Rapid rehousing, again, which also falls under that permanent housing umbrella, minimum of 6 out of 8. The project will, again, leverage public-private partnerships, require participation, and then applicants have previously operated a project where employment incomes improved. Okay, I ran through that super, super quick. Any questions that did not get answered that we should lift up here? Or things folks want me to better explain? Okay. Again, we're going to send all of this out in a follow-up email, including some helpful links to the NOFO itself. If you are applying for new funding, please read through this quality threshold criteria fully. And I will pass it back over to Jerry.
Okay, so in addition to meeting that project threshold criteria, HUD also reviews applications and does a risk review. And this risk review is completed for the organization that is applying for COC funding. So where the project threshold is specific to the project, the risk review is specific to the organization. This is standard that HUD conducts risk reviews. And this year it incorporates some additional criteria. So it has always, or at least in the recent years, HUD has always looked at organizational financial controls, effective management systems, audits. And really what HUD is trying to assess is your organization capable of receiving HUD funding that is highly regulated, highly monitored, and able to execute those programs effectively. This year they've added 2 additional criteria that we want to make sure you all are aware of. But the first is that they can use other public sources, such as newspapers, Inspector General, or other complaints that have been proven to have merit, really looking for a lack of alignment with HUD priorities this NOFO period. And then the second is a history of subsidizing or facilitating activities that conflict with the purposes in this NOFO. So that's another reason why we have called out a couple of times, really taking a deeper look at HUD's priorities and how they do or maybe not align with you as an organization. So please take that into consideration as you are considering if your organization is going to be pursuing these funds. Because ultimately, this information is going to be used by HUD to make funding decisions and apply award conditions when you actually enter the contracting process with HUD.
Sorry,
yes.
One quick thing I was just going to add, because I know other folks have asked questions about this in other webinars we've been in. Both of those new criteria Jerry just covered are really big. So we do not have a better definition of what those mean. This is directly from the NOFO and the language that they use. So just to recognize that in terms of like asking what exactly that means or what could be included here, we know that it's vague and it's just kind of the definition that we have.
And it is going to be important that you keep an eye on HUD's COC competition webpage. Historically, HUD will also publish a detailed application instructions that are going to be incredibly helpful in filling out the actual applications, but they will often also further define things that are a little bit more general or vague in the NOFO publication. So if those criteria are of concern for you or you want more information, I would look to HUD's resources once they have published them. Okay, another element that we want to discuss today is what is now called the merit review. Previously, this has been the COC scoring criteria. So back when we first started the webinar, I talked about the consolidated application versus the project application. We've been primarily talking about project applications, but the merit review is really focused on the COC as a whole. And there are some significant changes from prior Renofo use to this year that we want to go over. So as a COC, there is a total of 130 points available across 3 different areas. So we get up to 9 points for our project capacity review and ranking. So this is us as a COC demonstrating the existence of a coordinated, inclusive, and outcome-oriented community process for the solicitation, objective review, ranking, and selection of project applications. That's what we've been talking about today. So anybody in our COC is invited to apply for funding, and then we have a rating and ranking policy that our rating and ranking committee follows to rank those project applications. I also want to note we always have a scoring tool that we use to objectively review and score those applications. We are hoping that that tool will be publicly available for you all next week. So we're working with our committee to update the tool to reflect the changes to the SNOFO, and are hoping by the end of the next week that that will be published on our website. So keep an eye out for that. 40 of our points of the 130 come from system performance. So that is really looking at our COC system-wide performance measurements and our process and how we are reducing homelessness. So we're really looking largely to our homeless management information system for that data. We're working closely with that team to get all of that information. And then most of the points, 81, HUD is awarding based off of our COC coordination and engagement. This is us doing our best to demonstrate coordination with other systems of care that are serving individuals and families who are experiencing homelessness. And this will connect a little bit in a couple of slides about how funding is awarded, but how we score as a COC is directly relevant to how Tier 2 funding is going to be awarded. There are also 19 bonus points available, 15 if COCs have merged, which we have not, so we are not eligible for those. And then there are up to 4 policy initiative preference points that our COC may receive for either operating activities within opportunity zones or for demonstration of verifying immigration status. So we're looking into if we are eligible for, we'll be eligible for either of those, but those are bonus points. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about HUD selection process. This is, again, based off of what we know at this point, and it's different from former years. So when HUD is making funding decisions, they are considering that eligibility requirements and threshold review that Natalie talked about, the organizational risk review results, and then the COC merit review results. COC planning is the only non-competitive grant, and this is very typical. So HUD has allocated 5% of our annual renewal demand for planning. And that supports the lead agency, at this point that's the Division of Housing, to do things like this, to coordinate the NOFO, to improve our homeless response system more broadly, to do things like the point in time count that's coming up in January. So that is non-competitive, and all other project types are ranked by our rating and ranking committee, approved by our COC governing board, and then submitted to HUD to make funding decisions. Once those are submitted to HUD, all of the Tier 1 projects that pass project quality, eligibility, and risk review are awarded. So that's why we tend to think of Tier 1 projects as, I hate to say guaranteed, nothing is guaranteed, but they're safer. They are not at risk for not being renewed. And then HUD goes on to select projects for Tier 2. Again, they have to pass that project quality, eligibility, and risk review. And then I want to talk through a little bit about how Tier 2 funding will be made. So each project that's in tier 2 can get up to 100 points. 50 of those points come directly from the COC merit review score that we were just talking about. So, for example, if our COC, if Balance of State COC got a score of 65, that's 50% of our merit review, that would then be applied to all of our projects. So they would get 25 of the 50 available points, or 50%. So it is critical that our COC does the best we can to have the highest score possible. We will be sending out communications in the coming weeks broadly through our newsletter, through our board members, to gather information for that consolidated application. We encourage you all to participate in that regardless of if you're going to be submitting a project application or not. But if you are submitting a project application, this is where it is directly relevant to your ability to get funding, or your likelihood of getting funding. So that's 50 points. 40 points are then based on how the COC ranks the project. So the higher ranking your project, the more points you'll get in that section. And then up to 10 points for projects that have service participation requirements. This is another change from the recent years of HUD priorities. And again, encourage you to review the NOFO more in depth to understand the service participation requirements that will be asked of you if you are ultimately awarded HUD funding through this process. So HUD will go down the list of tier 2 projects until all of the funds are expended. Again, just look to understand this a little bit more in depth. This change in how HUD is awarding funding means that our first ranked tier 2 project could be scored after a mid-ranked project for a COC that had a higher merit score. So if a COC performs better than the Balance of State, their lower ranked projects will be awarded before our highest ranked projects. So really decreasing the likelihood that our tier 2 projects will be awarded the lower our COC scores. So just really trying to emphasize that how our COC performs nationally is going to be critical. Any questions on that? We know it's a little bit complicated before we get into the next steps in resources. And yes, thank you, Natalie, for shouting out. NAH, National Alliance to End Homelessness, has done a side-by-side comparison. It's really helpful of like how scoring has changed from last year to this year. So it's especially helpful if you are newer to, or if you are familiar with the COC process, to kind of see that change, but also if you're newer and really trying to understand how this project operates.
Cool. Okay, I don't see any questions coming through the chat, so we'll start wrapping up with some next steps and resources. So again, we will send these slides out. So these are all links that you'll be able to click on in the PDF of the slides, but this recording and the slides will be sent out to you all and then also posted on our DOH webpage. And that next webinar for those who have submitted an LOI is December 3rd, 2025. You will get added to that automatically once an LOI is filled out. And then a couple helpful links and resources. The NOFO itself is posted on grants.gov. Grants.gov is not always the easiest to navigate. If you're familiar with grants.gov, though, you can access it there. You can also access it on the NAEH website. So that link I put in the chat about the side-by-side comparisons from NAEH, which, by the way, is the National Alliance to End Homelessness. They also have it posted there if it's easier for you to get to. Again, there's a link to our DOH webpage. This is where we will also update regularly. So additional webinars will be posted there. All the deadlines we covered are already on there, etc. HUD's COC competition webpage will also be updated periodically. So this is where the detailed instructions should be posted once they're available. And then specifically wanted to call out the instructions for how to access project applications and eSnaps, which again are not available yet. But if you are not already in eSnaps, that is something that you can do now if you do plan on applying. And there are instructions on HUD's website, and then we've linked them directly here as well. And then just want to highlight again some key dates, especially because of our condensed timeline and how quickly these are approaching. That LOI is again due by end of day, November 28th, and it is non-binding. Also, that LOI is available. It was sent out in a newsletter, but it is also available on the DOH webpage. So we will send it out in our follow-up email, but it's available right now on the DOH Balance of State webpage. That second webinar is December 3rd from 12 to 1. Project applications are due to the COC by December 14th, 11:59 Mountain Time. Preliminary rankings will be shared with project applicants by end of workday, so 5 p.m. on December 19th. And then appeals, will be due by 3 p.m. on Monday, December 22nd. So those are the really key dates that we wanted to remind you all about. Again, the full timeline and full dates are posted on our website. Okay, that is the content that we have for y'all today. Any questions? I believe we got to all the ones in the chat, but are there other questions that folks have and want to ask while we've got time?
And I'm going to stop the recording because we are going to be putting out an FAQ document. So if you're watching this recording, you will not be missing any of these questions, but want to give people an opportunity without being recorded. So I'm going to stop that.